The NATO member, Turkey, has decided to purchase S-400 defense systems from Russia. As you can imagine, this is rustling some feathers in Washington, D.C. Welcome to the Real News Network. I'm Sharmini Pires, coming to you from Baltimore. Turkey's relations with the U.S. have been strained over the last few years. The newest crisis seems to be quite severe. Turkey has decided to purchase S-400 missile defense systems from Russia, and the U.S. is considering refusing to sell the new F-35 stealth bombers to Turkey in retaliation. It is not just because U.S. arms manufacturers want Turkey's defense procurement budget, but more so the suspicion that S-400 missile defense systems can somehow spy on NATO technology and send information to the Russian military. Vice President Mike Pence expressed his dismay at Turkey's decision to buy S-400s in an interview last week. Let's watch.
Turkey's purchase of a $2.5 billion S-400 anti-aircraft missile system from Russia poses great danger to NATO and to the strength of this alliance. Turkey must choose. Does it want to remain a critical partner of the most successful military alliance in the history of the world? Or does it want to risk the security of that partnership by making reckless decisions that undermine our alliance?
And here is Turkey's foreign minister responding to these questions that Mike Pence poses.
When you meet with Secretary of State Pompeo and National Security Advisor Bolton, who you're scheduled to meet with here in Washington, will you tell them that Turkey is still going to go through with this purchase of the Russian system, the S-400?
Definitely.
Added to the
Definitely.
That
It's a done deal.
It's a done deal.
It's a done deal. And even President Trump admitted on the phone that it was the mistake of the previous administration of the United States that they couldn't sell Patriots to us. This is not a choice for us.
Still on the table, is it not?
No, this is a done deal.
But the offer of Patriots is still being made.
We received a recent proposal from the United States, but it doesn't guarantee that the United States will be able to sell Patriots to Turkey because we couldn't get it for the last 10 years. That's why we had to buy from Russia.
Joining us now to discuss the heat that this generates at NATO and beyond is Richard Sakwa. Richard is Professor of Russian and European Politics at the University of Kent and Associate Fellow of Russia and Eurasia Program at Chatham House. And his most recent book is Russia's Futures, published by Polity Press. Richard, good to have you here.
Hello.
All right, Richard, this is a pretty audacious move on the part of Turkey to purchase these weapons from Russia, and particularly because they're a NATO member. Is this pointing to some crisis within NATO?
Yeah, I think it reflects the larger crisis of, if you like, the Atlantic system. Vice President Pence had a point. He did talk about NATO as the most successful alliance in history. The thing is that it was successful until 1989-91, the end of the Soviet Union, the end of the Cold War, and it had achieved its goals. And since then, now it's over 25, nearly 30 years, it's been looking for a role to play. And what it's managed to do is to perpetuate Cold War attitudes and ultimately facilitated what I call and others call not just a new Cold War, but a substantive second Cold War. But in this second Cold War, the actors and the patterns of politics will change. And this is what's happening with Turkey today. It's been obviously one of, not quite a founding member, but a member who joined a couple of years after NATO was established in 1949. And it's beginning to find the strategic options within NATO too limiting. And that's why it's establishing not just this sale with Russia for S-400s, but also close energy links and constant partnership over Syria.
Richard, the speculation, as you say, that the S-400 system can somehow gather information on NATO weapons systems and then send them over to Russia, is it a fact or is it just paranoia?
Nowadays, the sophistication of these missile and other systems is so intense that, I'm a non-expert, there will be legitimate fears that once you have an S-400, its enormous power, basically, it can track objects, 10, 15 objects, 400, 500 kilometers away. And, if it can do that, who knows what other powers and facilities it may have. So clearly, it's by purchasing these, it weakens the, if you like, just like the political or military, but the technical solidarity of NATO. So clearly, there's a legitimate fear that this could be the case.
Richard, from the point of view of Turkey, what does it have to gain from buying a defensive system like S-400 rather than the offensive F-35?
In a sense that, there's plenty of planes they could buy. They're not commensurate at the moment. They needed this defense system because clearly Turkey feels threatened. There's the region, Middle East, is highly unstable, has been destabilized, of course, far worse, over the last decades. And I was going to say the war in Iraq has unleashed powerful forces. But even before that, it was certainly not a peaceful zone. Israel's position has strengthened, and obviously relations between Israel and Turkey are not good. So they do feel they need a defensive capacity. And as we heard, they didn't manage to get the Patriot missile defense system. There's also a technical issue. There is the general view, and I'm no expert, that the S-400 is technically the best in the world. And so if they're going to pay so much money, they'd like to get the best in the world. There have been teething issues with the F-35 plane. I'm sure they're going to sort them out. The US will deal with it. But at the moment, the F-35 has had all sorts of, it's been long delayed in its development. There's nothing, maybe, it really would be a shock to the NATO system if the Turks in the end decide to buy the Su-35, which is one of the world's best planes as well. So what we are seeing is, as I mentioned before, an unfreezing of the post-Cold War situation. And Turkey perhaps appears to be in the vanguard of this shifting alliance system.
Richard, this is quickly becoming a geopolitical issue. Now, Russia is selling S-400 systems not only to Turkey, but India and, of course, Syria, and S-300 systems that were actually used in Syria, which helps to protect President Assad. So all this is going on with NATO at the center of this, which is supposed to be the most powerful military alliance in the world. What does this mean?
There's always been an intense fight, as it were, for arms markets. And Russia is more or less maintaining its position second largest arms seller in the world, sometimes slightly eclipsed. But basically, after the United States, who is by far the biggest arms seller, the leader by far. So by purchasing weapons, of course, it's clearly a statement of an intent of geopolitical pluralism. When China or Turkey buys such a system, it's clearly a sense that it has this choice, as it were, and it isn't subject to the demands of a single power. Right. So what we're now seeing is, through arms sales and the diversity of arms sales, India, you mentioned, other countries who refuse to be bound by the discipline of NATO. Certainly Turkey, even as a NATO member, Turkey will not be bound by the NATO's discipline.
Now, Richard, of course, this means that Russia is increasing its influence around the world, because it's not just the sale of these arms. You then have training, you have maintenance of this equipment, there's ongoing sale of ammunition and so on as well that comes with this influence. Tell us more about how this falls out in terms of geopolitical relations.
You're quite right about arms. Don't forget that also Russia is supplying and building a nuclear power station, a multi-block nuclear power station for Turkey, which means a long-term commitment, 30, 40, 50 years for maintenance, for supply, for raw material, and the core supply, and so on. So, and indeed pipelines. So it's a very long-term commitment. And as you say, if you buy any equipment like a pipeline, it shifts the geopolitical, geoeconomic balance for decades ahead. So this is a sign that that post-Cold War world, which the existence and continuation enlargement of NATO, effectively, it meant it tried to freeze the situation of US-led dominance after 1991. And that dominance, that freezing moment, is beginning to unfreeze. And we're beginning to get a far more fluid situation where people won't buy into that particular model of politics. It may have given advantages and benefits at a certain point, but all things, including the world's most successful military alliance, will come to an end one day. And perhaps these are the first signs of that coming end.
Richard, in terms of the immediate future and its U.S. relations with Turkey, what is going to be fallout of this? I mean, Erdogan just lost the capital city in terms of the elections. Is he still a strong man? And is he able to maintain this kind of distance with the United States and still survive as a NATO member?
I mean, there's two things. First, just to say that there's major tension with the United States over the end game in the Syrian conflict. As you know, the United States has been supporting the Kurdish forces to the east of the Euphrates River, whereas Turkey considers the fighters, YPG, etc., as no more than another form of their long-term enemy, the PKK, the Kurdish forces in the east of their country. So that's a big contradiction. What, in terms of politics and what this means in terms of the alliance, it's just yet another sign of this fluidity. As we see, Erdogan is weakened by the loss not only of Istanbul and Ankara. If those victories of the opposition are confirmed, it means that his nearly 25-year dominance, certainly nearly 20 years as leader of the country, is becoming a bit more shaky. Even as his formal constitutional powers increase, politically, he's becoming more vulnerable.
Richard, in terms of NATO and the alliance, and of course we can't talk about that without talking about Europe and Germany and other critical members, how are they receiving this Turkey's positioning with Russia?
Well, Turkey, of course, is one of the key partners in the management of the migration issue. There's several million Syrians in Turkey. The European Union is providing large funds in terms of billions of euros for support in camps and so on, so that they don't try to come to Europe. So it's an essential partner in that respect. Also, it's clear that Turkey's EU ambitions will not be fulfilled anytime soon. And in fact, I don't think that Turkey believes it will join in the next decade or two, if not longer. And it's beginning to look elsewhere for partnerships. As for Germany and the European Union itself, it's had how many summits now? 2, 3, 4 on Brexit. Macron came to power with ambitious ideas on intensifying unity amongst the Euro partners, the 19 countries in the Eurozone, also for greater autonomy of Europe in defense matters. All these things are going forwards, but much more slowly than anticipated. And there's not been established the traditional Franco-German locomotive at the heart of Europe. Until Brexit is solved, which may not be anytime soon, then Europe is stuck in one spot and it's not really going forwards. The big thing, of course, now are the European Parliament elections in next month, in May 2019. And it's almost certain that so-called populists, mostly of the right, some of the left, will have a much larger position and possibly even a dominant position. And that really will be a game changer in Europe, because European Parliament chooses, at the moment, if they can get their Spitzenkandidaten, that is their list candidate, to be the nominated successor to the existing head of the European Commission, Jean-Claude Juncker, as well as the team at the head of the European Commission. So Europe is going to be bound up for the next year or so in domestic matters.
I've been speaking with Professor Richard Sakwa. His most recent book is Russia's Futures with Polity Press. I thank you so much for joining us.
My pleasure.
And thank you for joining us here on the Real News Network.